right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome once again. Strap on your goggles, get ready. It's time to go deep. It's time for another deep dive. Yes, indeed, with Embarcadero Technologies today. I'm very excited to have our friends from Embarcadero on the call. Of course, this is yours truly, host Eric Kavanagh. Hit me up on Twitter at Eric_Kavanagh. It's Kavanagh, the Irish spelling. I went to Dublin. I looked in the phone book. That's how it's spelled. And the mission here in the briefing room is really to let vendors showcase their technology and have a one-on-one interaction with an analyst from our team. Sometimes, of course, it'll be yours truly. And we're really trying to get into the weeds of the technology to understand what makes it tick, what is the business need being addressed here, how does this stuff work, why is this happening, and how does it all fit together. So that's the whole idea with Deep Dive. Talking about data modeling today, getting down to business. So data modeling I've always viewed as this wonderful lens through which you can understand a business model and, of course, data flow, because data and business go hand in hand. And the better your business models are, or the better your data models are, the better people understand your business. Now, there is this concept of the object-relational mismatch. I'm going to be frank here and tell you I'm going to learn about it today, or at least learn a lot more than I know already. So I'm very pleased to have an expert in the field on the line. But it has created some friction and resulted in some gaps over the years. And there's this new concept that Embarcadero has come up with called a business data object. And frankly, I think it sounds pretty darn clever. So with that, I'm going to introduce Ron Huizenga, Senior Product Manager for ER Studio over there at Embarcadero. And Ron, please educate me. Take it away.
Thank you, Eric. What I'm going to do is I'll just fire up the slide deck here so you can see what's going on my monitor. Okay, so what I'm going to talk today is a little bit of background in terms of the historical object and relational mismatch. And I've got a slide that I'll go through a few points on that. And then I'm going to introduce something that's coming out in our ER Studio 2016 release, which is the business data objects. And to give you a bit of positioning on that, I'm going to walk through an example. So I'll talk about a typical data model and some of the challenges that myself and others have faced in terms of trying to fit the concept of which business objects tie into different entities or tables in a data model. And then I'll show how we can resolve that issue with our ER Studio 2016 release, where we have business data objects embedded directly into the product itself. And I'll be showing you that in the context of a demo, and then we'll go through and we'll have some concluding questions and remarks about that as well. So let's talk about the object-relational mismatch a little bit. And anyone who's been in the industry for quite some time has probably heard a bit of the debate about data models and the relational notation versus UML class models and that type of thing. I'll talk about each of them at a very high level separately here. First, when we're talking about data models, we're typically talking about potentially three different levels of models. People may do conceptual models, logical models, which are independent of the physical implementation, and then take that down to a physical data model so they can actually generate the DDL specific to a back-end target database, whether it be SQL Server, Oracle, or even some of the newer big data platforms like MongoDB, like we do in our tools today as well. Now, typically what we would see in a data modeling tool are the relational notations, and it might be a James Martin notation, IDEF notations, or others that are there. Typically, there's a selection of notations available. But the big thing is that it's truly based on the relational paradigm for the most part, very strong DDL capabilities. If you're working in logical models, you're thinking of entities. Physically, you're thinking in terms of tables, and they're tied together. Now, when we're looking at this, this is typically the modeling approach favored by data architects, modelers, and DBAs, and people that are working with databases all the time. On the flip side, for a number of years, when we saw the object movement come out, we also saw the idea of class models evolve. So the UML class model is more of a single level type of model in terms of not having like a conceptual, logical, and physical layer to it per se, and it's fairly abstract. And again, there's a specific UML notation for class models, so you can have the concept of objects, some of the methods against those objects, and that type of thing. And tools that offer them typically do offer some type of DDL generation, but quite often it's generic and not targeted to the specific physical back-end platforms. Again, they're using the concept of classes that are represented and the relationship between those classes, which people generically refer to objects quite often. The audiences that tend to favor the UML class models are the application architects and application developers. So you can see a bit of the mismatch starting to evolve already in terms of you're trying to deliver solutions with a multi-role team, data modelers working with developers and application architects and that type of thing. Slightly different paradigms. So what we're really trying to do is we're bridging that gap with the concept of a business data object. So let me just talk about what is a business data object in terms of what we're talking about in our tool, and then I'll show it to you. Really what I'm doing with the business data object is I'm bridging the object and relational paradigms. So we're able to represent that higher level class or object, but also represent the entities that may comprise those higher level concepts or objects. The nice thing about this is we can represent these fairly high level concepts from either a user perspective or a developer perspective as well, as they may be used to seeing them. And we're doing that in a very visual fashion that encapsulates the entities and tables that are involved. We allow it in our logical modeling. It will carry down to the physical model when we generate physical models from those logical models, or you can even introduce it just at the physical modeling layer as well. So wherever you want to use it, you've got a lot of flexibility. It's very easy to understand, as you'll see in the demo. And the really important thing here is it really represents what that object means. People building larger solutions, particularly if they've done anything like service-oriented architecture and that type of thing, are used to representing objects and building data services for those objects themselves. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of concepts in there in terms of the containment of the entities themselves and what we call the anchor entity within a business data object. And the really nice thing is you're going to see the ability that we can collapse and expand the visual representations to really make it suit different audiences that are looking at it. And then we'll talk a little bit more again about, once you've seen it, talking about those modern data architectures and where we see this going forward. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to exit the demo or the slideshow itself, and I'm going to show you a typical data model. Now, this isn't fully attributed. So what I've got here is a fairly simplistic scenario. I've got about 15 entities in this particular model, but it's a fairly typical scenario that you might see in an organization that's doing things. So if you look at the top left of the model, for an example, you see the concept of like a purchase order header and a purchase order line. You also see things like an item. So obviously the purchase order lines have items on them. And in this example, maybe I'm a manufacturer, so there are some items that I purchased, there are some items that I actually manufacture. And the idea in subtyping, which is what the symbol is in between there, is I may have different attributes that I care about depending on what the subtype of that item is. Then as I move right across the top, same type of thing as a purchase order, but I'm talking about things like the sales order and the sales order line within that order. And then off to the far right, the interaction of that in terms of the customer. This is a fairly straightforward model in terms of what people are used to seeing in data modeling terms. Now, the challenge is, particularly when you're trying to build in these more complex architectures with data services and everything else, is the people building those services think in terms of what are the objects. So I'm going to start at the top left and take that example. They might have a purchase order object, but it's really comprised of the purchase order header and the purchase order line, and there may be other tables embedded in that as well in a more complex structure. But they want to be able to handle that object as a single unit of work. And as well, not just in this type of a data model, but the data modelers may want to represent in a more enterprise model what those specific distinct business objects are. And that represents a bit of a challenge in the traditional data modeling world. If I want to see what those are, one of the things that we have in data modeling tools is the idea to have what we call submodels or subject areas in those particular models. So what you would typically see somebody try to do if they just wanted to have a catalog of the separate objects, for instance, purchase order on one, sales order on another, they end up with a lot of different submodels that are out there. So if I do that, if I go down to, I'm going to have something here that I've done is I created an object catalog, which is no shapes or anything around it, that I'm really basically trying to show what those different things are. So if I click down, what you might see is a typical model, they might want to show a customer object. And all that would be in there would be the customer address in this particular scenario, and potentially a couple of other entities that are bundled that really constitute that customer object itself. On the item in our example, they may set it up and have a subject area that's dedicated to showing the item and its subtypes and what it owns. And same type of thing on the supplier, same type of thing that we're doing there. So as you can see, what you end up doing in this type of a scenario is you're really dedicating a lot of space in terms of setting up a lot of different subject areas in your model just to represent these fairly simplistic concepts. Now, another way that you can do it, and something that I used to do prior to us introducing the business data objects in ER Studio, is I used to try to at least make it a little bit more usable to myself. So I would take that same data model, and I'm still in our old version here, and I used to draw a shape around it so at least I could see the boundary, for instance, on the purchase order, what entities were contained in that purchase order. The problem is, even doing this type of a thing, it's something that you're repetitively doing that on every subject area where you're trying to represent this purchase order or one of these other items. You're bringing the entities in, and then you're finding yourself moving these shapes and stuff around to do it. So there still is a lot of tedious manual effort involved with it. And again, at that point, it's only a drawing object, and you don't really have the metadata that tells you that the purchase order header and the purchase order line truly belong to a purchase order object. Now, having said that, I would like to switch gears now and show you what does this look like in ER Studio 2016. So I'm going to go to another environment here, show you that environment. So I've got that same model here, and I'm going to go up to my root model where I started out. Now, you're going to see something a little bit different here. When you looked at the previous environment, what you saw is you might have seen the main model and the other subject areas down the left-hand side with the folders that show the different submodels. What you did not see in the old version was this concept showing in the outline of business data objects. You'll notice that's off to the left-hand side, and you'll also notice there's an icon on the toolbar up top that we can click and use to create business data objects in our diagramming surface itself. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to do that for a couple of them here, just to give you an example of that. And then what I'm going to do is, I find the easiest way to do is as I start, I just click it near the ones I want to encapsulate. I'll draw the business data object around them. And interestingly enough, it's really starting to represent the way I tried to do it with those shapes before, but there's a huge difference here. I'm now going to click this. I'm going to call this purchase order as an object. If I want to use it in a physical implementation, I can give it a physical name as well. For this one, I'm just going to remove the spaces and type it in that way. But now this is where we really start to separate ourselves from what is going on there. So if I go now, I'm going to click the containment object or button. What I want to do is I want to say, which objects does this purchase order object, or which entities does it actually contain? So I'm going to go through, I'm going to click purchase order header and purchase order line, and now I'm going to click that. The other important thing is we've now said that this is an object, it contains these particular entities, so when we're talking about utilizing it in other diagrams, it's available as a collection of these underlying entities within the object. However, when we're doing things like building data services and all those types of things around it, you want to know what the top of the food chain or what the top of the pyramid is in that particular business data object, and that's what we call the anchor. Think of it in terms of this model where I've got the purchase order header and order line. I've got a key dependent relationship there between the order header and the order line. So the header contains a number of different purchase order lines within it. So I'm going to click that header, and I'm just going to click the set anchor, and now I've got that data object defined. I'm just going to do the other one here as well.
Yeah, and real quick, I'm guessing that one of the benefits here is you're trying to promote the easy reuse of object models, of business object models, to facilitate future designs, to streamline processes, and also to clarify models. Is that right?
Absolutely, because as you do it, you get a lot more context just looking at what's happening on your models themselves. Oops, I'll just do this one very quickly here because I want to show you something on the containment. You'll notice when I click the containment this time, I have a shorter list of entities to pick from, and that's because I've already consumed the purchase order header and the purchase order line entities in that purchase order object itself. Because you're dealing about the objects and what owns them and what you're going to be using for building data services and persistence and everything else, a given entity can only belong to one particular business data object. So as I've added them into the business data objects, this list gets shorter and shorter in terms of what's available to me in the model itself. So in this one, I'm picking the item, the manufactured item subtype, the purchase item subtype. I show that, and that, whoops, helps if you can actually hit the right button. And then we've got that set. And there we go. Now here's an interesting thing about it is I'm going to do this sort of like a cooking show before we go a little bit further because I've actually created them for a few other objects in the model there as well. So I'm coming back up to this logical model. What I've done here is I've created the business data objects for the major concepts in my model themselves. So I've got interaction between a number of different objects in the model itself. I've got the purchase order with what it contains, interaction to the supplier who the purchase order is from, the items on the purchase order, and of course then we start going over to the other side of the business where we have the concept of sales orders and customers interacting with that. Here, I'm seeing all the detail within it. The nice thing is I can move these around, and as I move them around, they move as a unit. But if I want to simplify this display just to show some higher level interactions, we've got this little click mark over here on the top right corner. So if I just double click that, I can easily collapse them down. So now I get a very nice selective display of what's out there. But you notice something interesting happening here. I can move them around, but even though I've collapsed them, it retains my relationships to the other objects in the model. If those objects happen to be expanded, I still see exactly which entity in those models go to. So for instance, the purchase to the item here and the purchase item down to the supplier. But as soon as I collapse that particular one, I'm now seeing that higher level, but I'm still seeing the relationships between these. So it really makes it a lot easier to work with.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm guessing that on really complex data models, this can be a very useful tool just to get it down to the point where the human eye and brain can really ascertain what's going on without too much difficulty, whereas with some of the more complex environments, you're going to be staring at that thing for a while and, your eyes start to cross, right?
Exactly. And you might want to render different views of this. Now the beautiful part of this is I'm going to go to the left-hand side for a second as well. It's not just the drawing surface itself where you've got this. You may have noticed as I was creating these, if I go to my main model on this tree, I see the business data objects. It knows in this model area that I'm displaying, I've actually created 5 business data objects. What I can actually do is underneath those, it's created the business data objects and shows me even in the tree exactly which entities are nested within that business data object itself as well. So it really makes it very easy to work with. And again, I can collapse and contract all of that information as well. Now, the other thing that I can do is, let's say I'm somewhere else in the model, and it doesn't really matter where in the model I am. Let's go back to a traditional type of model here, and I happen to have that another viewpoint still represented in this model where I didn't have the frames around it. And that's also very important. I'm not forced to display the object frames where I don't want to. So in viewpoints where I only want to show entities and relationships, I can do that, but because they're all tied back into the same concept of the model, I still know exactly which business data object they're part of. So if I go into purchase order line for as an example here, I'm just going to turn that. I'm going to open that up. I've got a number of tabs in the metadata editor for my purchase order line entity, but one of the things that we have that's very important for us is we have a where used capability that shows us where a particular item is used, whether it's in our data model subject areas, even in our business modeling tool or business architect tool. But what you'll also see here is if this entity is part of a business object, that's the first thing that's going to show. So it shows that it's part of that purchase order business data object right in the where used display. So you can imagine in a model where you've got a couple thousand entities or that type of thing, you can very easily find out which object something's part of just by looking at the where used as well. And the nice thing is the way we can represent this is now that we have, if we start to define these business objects, as we're building out more and more subject areas in the models themselves or submodels in the models themselves, we can literally take the business object, put it into a submodel, and it will bring, by default, all of the entities that are part of that business object with it into the submodel itself. And then what we can do for that particular submodel view is we don't have to show everything that's contained within that submodel itself either. So if I go, for instance, to, I've created one here called purchase order entry. I've represented 3 of the objects here, purchase order, item, and supplier. But what you'll notice is because I didn't really care about, for instance, the manufactured item, and I didn't really care about the supplier address details so much for this particular view, just to render this example, is I was able to drop those out of this view, even though they're still part of the object, but I can still see the parts that I'm interested in within the frame of the object itself. So I've got a ton of flexibility to be able to represent this. The one really important point about this is it's not just limited to the data modeling environment in terms of, I consider this our data modeling design environment because this is the ER Studio Data Architect. What's equally important is to be able to communicate this out to all the other constituents that you're working with in your organization and your projects. So we have a collaborative solution as part of ER Studio Enterprise Team Edition, which is called Team Server. We can publish our models out to Team Server, and they're not just static model images in terms of what you would see here. So what you can do is you can publish them out. They will publish exactly as I have represented them in the design environment. So in other words, if I had taken this particular model but I'd chosen to collapse, for instance, the item entity and move that around, when I publish the model, that's how it will go out to Team Server for this particular submodel. But as a user, I can go in there, open up that submodel in our interactive viewer in Team Server. I can expand and collapse the business data objects regardless of how they came into that diagram. I can move things around, and I can actually click on every object and get to the underlying metadata and properties for the object itself and all of the entities contained within that particular business object. So with that, before I go further, I'll just stop for a second and see if you have any follow-on questions you want to ask about this, Eric.
Yeah, well, I definitely see how this facilitates the design side and the exploration and investigation of the models. I'm kind of curious, what changes underneath the hood? In other words, does this somehow optimize the creation of DDLs, or what else happens under the covers as a result of this new layout?
Well, the nice thing is obviously we can select entities and that type of thing, and we can generate DDL for our entities and that type of thing from a physical model based on the target platform we want. So I can literally take one of these logical models, I can generate a physical model from it for the target platform and generate the DDL, and that's for whatever perspective I've got in that submodel and whatever range I want in there. What we can also do, however, is we have an XML generation capability as well. So we can generate the XML for the tables and entities right now in our tool, and where we're going to take this moving forward is there are a lot of frameworks out there in terms of service-oriented architecture frameworks and that type of thing, where they're dealing in terms of objects. So what we're looking at going forward is being able to generate XML specific to those particular frameworks at the object level. So the idea is, if you wanted to start to generate things like your data services and the representation of something like a purchase order, you would take the purchase order object, generate the XML for it. When we're dealing with those different SOA frameworks and that type of thing, all of them have slightly different implementations. So what we're looking at is being able to import and export from those as we move into the future, similar to how we utilize bridges to interchange metadata with other tools out there as well. So again, really expanding us in terms of being able to pull together an organization's data architecture, not only from a modeling perspective, but from our metadata, our glossaries, and everything else, and really starting to be able to push that in and out of other suites that really make up the ecosystem of tools, as it were, within an organization.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, so what you're really talking about here is future-proofing the environment, right?
Absolutely, future-proofing the environment. And as you know, a lot of organizations, when they, particularly those that are extremely serious about the data modeling and that type of thing, they may have some very large repositories of models that represent concepts across different platforms and everything else. So what this allows them to do is allows them to pull together concepts such as an enterprise model, start to put this object layer over top of that model in terms of what are the business objects that we're concerned about as a business, and then underneath they can start to stitch together those different models through concepts like our universal mappings and everything else, so they know where all the manifestations of these concepts are across their entire data landscape. It becomes a very critical investment, particularly in understanding what the data is, what you're calling it, and how you utilize that data in your organization. And the only means to really get a handle around all of that, because of the complexity, is to have a very solid modeling solution in place that can show that to you.
Yeah, so it's not just future-proofing, it's also really providing the capability to better understand the past and reuse those old assets, and also to reconcile all these old models with current views of the business, right?
Absolutely, and also from the different stakeholder viewpoints as well. It may be from, for instance, data stewards and understanding what things are and defining them. It could be people writing reports. It could be people using BI solutions, a business analyst. Everybody has a role to play in this, and allowing them to collaborate on this at both the object and the lower level data construct levels is extremely important, depending on who the audience is that you're working with.
Yeah, and I'm guessing it's also going to be really useful in helping business people better understand why these models are so important and what they actually mean, because if you can show me something like we're looking at here versus some of those more complex diagrams where you've got hundreds of objects and lines going every which way, that's just going to make a business person's eyes glaze over, I guess, right?
Absolutely, and in fact, I think you and I have probably both heard the phrase uttered that you don't share data models with business users because they're too complex and they can't relate to them. So if I go back to where we started here, if I take that typical data model, now this is a fairly simplistic one, so a business user probably could understand it, but now think of one that has many more entities in it, or hundreds of entities in it. It becomes very difficult to understand. But if I go up to the viewpoint where I've actually got the concept of the business data objects in my models, as I start collapsing these things down, it becomes very easy for a business user to relate to the concept that, oh yeah, we have purchase orders that contain items, for instance. We get our purchase orders or order from suppliers. We can talk about the sales orders and the interaction with the customer. So now what we're really doing is kind of a byproduct of this is we've almost bundled conceptual modeling as a layer over above this, because we're dealing at the object level that's hiding the complexity below those objects at that layer or lower, and all we have to do is click a plus sign to get to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other thing, too, that I've been really curious to watch is how the discipline of data modeling is now being used quite actively to leverage many of these new data sets, so-called big data, for example. And obviously there is more and more of that available in different iterations from different sources and different types. And it seems to me that what you're doing here is you are facilitating the incorporation of these new data types in a manner that's easy for, of course, the modeler to understand, but the business person to understand as well. Is that right?
Absolutely, because when you look at our modeling environment itself, I mean, I've shown you this at a logical model level right now, but we actually have the native capabilities, big data capabilities for both Hadoop Hive and MongoDB. And even MongoDB has some things like embedded objects and object arrays in it that we've extended our notation for. The beauty is, it's the same modeling environment that we have here, so we can encapsulate those in these objects just like we do any of the other constructs that you've seen here today. So it really glues that together independent of what the underlying implementation platform is.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And you know, data flow is such an important topic these days, especially as companies take more advantage of these new data types. And it seems to me you're also giving better visibility into that world, right?
Absolutely, and in fact, I didn't bring an example of it today, but we actually have the capability right within our data modeling tool as well to create data lineage diagrams. So we can pull the different data pieces and we can outline the transformations. And in fact, in the Studio Enterprise Team Edition, we also have bundled what we call our data lineage add-on right into the product itself. So they can extract some of that metadata for these data lineage diagrams from ETL tools such as SQL Server Information Services, Oracle Data Integrator, and those types of things, and pull that information directly into diagrams that depict what that ETL does right within the modeling space itself.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's actually kind of a big deal, right? Because a lot of times one of the real pain points of ETL is that it's almost like a black box, at least if you're not the one who designed the script. From what I understand, there are definitely some older ETL scripts and environments where it can be quite difficult to really decompose what's happening, and that's where a lot of data quality problems come from, right?
Absolutely, and you're correct, and you're exactly right. I mean, you look at it, it's just like any other type of code, right? Whether it's SSIS or a developer writing Java, you're somewhat at the mercy of whoever's written that to make sure that they've documented it properly and everything else. But at least being able to interrogate that and bring it back and give you a picture of what's going on for those transformations is extremely important. Now, it's obvious that that's kind of an adjunct to this particular topic, but one of the things that we're really trying to set ourselves up for is really enabling a business-driven data architecture throughout the enterprise. And a big facet of that going forward to us is really being able to help organizations to get a handle on what is that enterprise data lineage, what's the journey of the data through their organization, how does it transform, which systems does it go through for any particular concept that they're interested in. So these are all building blocks to help us stitch all of that together.
Yeah, so a company that sees this video, for example, and recognizes the business value, they want to go out and add this to their environment. What does the process look like of rolling this out? I mean, I'm guessing that there's a fair amount of the process that can be automated in terms of ingesting old models. You kind of point the engine at the repository of models, but someone does have to then start going in and do what you had just done there, which is define this is a business data object, this is a business data object. There is a manual part to it, but how much of that is manual versus how much of it can be dynamically driven once you purchase the product?
I guess one of the bigger points there is obviously how clean those different back-end data sources are. For instance, if they've done things like followed naming conventions that are fairly consistent in a particular environment, one of the things that we can do is we can point the data modeling tool to a particular database, and we can reverse engineer what that schema looks like. And then we'll have, obviously, the physical manifestation of that as a data model in our tool itself. If they've got fairly clean naming conventions, we can literally take those naming conventions and do what we call a naming standards template, and we can apply it in reverse. So we can take those physical names and map them to the English names for each of those abbreviations or physical names, for instance. So, for instance, if you had EMP meant employee and you were consistent, CUS meant customer, and maybe they use underscores or that type of thing, we can actually build them up the opposite way around. So we can apply the naming conventions, so it now gives you an English name for all of your entities that correspond to those physical tables. And once you've kind of taken that first step and applied reasonable names to them, then it's fairly easy to go through and start to say, yes, I know what the associated items are here now, and plus you can trace through the relationships to find things, and you can start to group them into your business objects fairly easily. The nice thing is you don't have to boil the ocean and do this all in one step. You're going to want to concentrate on the more important concepts first, and then you can start to build out your models and add that extra layer of abstraction, if you will, by bundling what you need to into the objects as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm guessing, too, that as you go through this process and use these business data objects, you're also going to be finding areas in some of these older models, or maybe even some new models, where maybe there were some loose ends that were never tied, for example, or maybe there was something that had just kind of gone astray. Is that part of the calculus, too, is to really help the business users or the actual designers working with the tool make sure that they haven't missed something, make sure that they understand the entire picture, in other words, kind of clean up models?
Absolutely, and in fact, because what you're really dealing with is you're dealing with the physical implementations on the back end, and you're bringing those back into the modeling tool. So as a consultant before I joined Embarcadero, I found that a lot of my work, especially over the last years, was less of designing data models and generating DDL to build things going forward, but it was really going into corporate environments, reverse engineering these databases, and helping them make sense of what was going on there. And just by reverse engineering those platforms into the data modeling tool, you can very quickly uncover all manner of sins in terms of things that are missing, entities, or for instance, that have been orphaned, they don't have proper referential integrity. The pictures very quickly allow you to hone in on a lot of defects that may be present in those other implementations. So it gives you an opportunity to address those and fix those as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I have to think there are so many of those orphans lying around, especially in organizations that have been using these technologies for 10, 20 years, some of them even longer. And let's face it, people make mistakes, and before we had all this impact analysis capability, it was just manual work to find that stuff, right? Whereas now you have these tools to be able to understand, like you say, the lineage, also the impact, you know, where do these objects get used, where does this show up, and be able to use the tools to optimize what it amounts to the infrastructure for your information architecture, right?
Absolutely, and kind of a little story off to the side that I can tell you about this as well is in one of those projects, to make a long story short, I had reverse engineered probably a dozen different back-end systems that we were replacing on one of the projects I was on to see what was out there in terms of the implementations, and it was across different database platforms. But I actually had these data models plastered up on the walls in this one area. And we happened to have a bit of an open house internally where some of the executives of the organization were coming to talk to us in this particular team, and I was talking to a VP of this business, and you've heard people say that business users don't typically understand data models. So just in a conversation with him, he said, "Can you tell me what all these pictures are on the wall?" So I gave him a very high-level explanation of a data model and how the lines showed how the different concepts were related to one another. And I said, now, if you look at this particular system over here, which happened to be one of their legacy systems, I said, you notice there are a lot of these boxes out here that don't have any lines between them. I said, what that really represents is the fact that in the implementation, those concepts weren't necessarily tied together, so there could be data that doesn't necessarily correlate between these different concepts in that same database. And he got that immediately, and he says, wow, he says, I'm going to call that particular one the Hall of Horrors. You know, it was near Halloween, so Hall of Horrors was probably a good word for it. So
pretty funny. Well, but you have to see this stuff to understand where it's going and what it's doing, and I think that's what the real beauty of this business object concept that you've come up with. Just out of curiosity, where did the idea come from? Was it out of a desire to solve this relational mismatch that you talked about?
It came out of, I guess you could say, a couple of different areas. It's really a practical solution, and it really comes from the suffering on a lot of projects from myself and other data architects that I had talked to, not only when I was a consultant, but also since I've been product manager here at Embarcadero for ER Studio, about how do we solve this problem and really allow companies to get better leverage on their models, whether they're models of the existing systems or whether they're trying to stitch together an enterprise data model or those types of things. And as we started talking to all these different people, this theme kept emerging as we needed this higher level of abstraction or models to really represent things not only from the modeling perspective, but when you're building these solutions, particularly using things like service-oriented architecture to say, here's the atomic unit that we're utilizing to build our data services and where we really want to relate these concepts together at a more abstracted level.
So that makes a lot of sense.
I guess it's born out of blood, sweat, and tears, like a lot of other things arise in the world, is finding a solution to address a pain that people are experiencing.
That's the exact term I was about to use, pain points, right? The pain points are what get addressed. It's wherever you find friction, that's where you want to put the lubrication, right?
Absolutely.
Cool beans. All right, this is great stuff, man. So, wow. What else should we tell people about? Anything else we want to share?
I guess one of the things I would share is this new capability is in ER Studio Data Architect 2016. And we, if you're a user of our products already and you've subscribing to it, you're going to get this on your update anyway. And if you're interested in our products, you can come to our website, and we have trial downloads, and our software consultants would gladly walk you through the concepts and show you how this works as well.
Okay, I know you had a couple of slides here in the end, so let me go ahead and push that slide that's got the information. So here's where you can go for some information more about that, learn more about ER Studio product family right there from these different links, and of course you can call. But this is great stuff, Ron. I can see you guys have been busy. I think you've done an excellent job of, once again, using a layer of abstraction to better articulate what's going on under the covers and help people understand how they can stitch together these environments, because, as you say, because of all these new needs for data services, I mean, it's a trend these days. More and more people are getting it. One of my favorite analysts, a guy named Rick Sherman, you may have run into from Athena IT Solutions, we were talking the other day, and he made this really interesting comment. He said he's noticed that there's been what he calls a silent disruption. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. What do you mean by that? He said lately in the last year or two, there are so many more business people who just intrinsically understand the importance of data. He said 5 years ago even, or certainly 10 years ago, it was kind of a rarity, the person who would really get it. He said now it's all over the place. And of course what that means is more business people are asking for more data. That's the data services you're talking about. And as you start feeding those new business people with information, you want to make darn sure that you have done your due diligence to ensure the quality of that data, to ensure that you understand the lineage, that it's governed data, that it's trusted data, because the more people use it, the more the errors are going to show themselves, and that's not a very good scene, right?
Absolutely, and it's really interesting because we seem to have gone through this period of time, and I don't know why, where for a while the focus on the importance of data was lost, and some people, made it an IT problem where there's really business owner of the data itself. So it takes me back to my manufacturing days. I used to be CIO of a manufacturing company many years ago, and for us, the data was everything. We wanted to make sure that everything was absolutely accurate so that we had absolute accurate bills of material, costing, and everything else. So when we built our forecasts and generated basically our MRP requirements and everything else, everybody in the organization was singing to the same hymnal, and we were all in lockstep in terms of implementing our plans.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, and manufacturing, of course, is a perfect industry to reference because it's just so incredibly important to have the right materials at the right time in the right place, that the equipment is working properly. I used to be big in the printing business myself, and I can tell you time on the press was the most important thing. If that press wasn't running, they weren't making any money. So manufacturing is one of those areas where it's like a crucible for getting process right and data right and so forth. So I think it's good news that you came from that environment because you brought with you that attention to detail and that assiduous nature of dealing with data, right?
Absolutely. And one thing that people need to remember as well is if you get your data in great shape, it can become a competitive advantage. And in that particular scenario, without going into it in too much detail, before we paid attention to that data, before I was involved in the organization, we had a bunch of stocked finished goods that we were selling, and we were selling industrial equipment that was in many different configurations. So some things may have sat on the shelf for a long time. Other things you may not have had in stock, so you were scrambling trying to get out to customers. So within a period of a few years and paying attention to the detail and everything else, we actually got ourselves into a situation where we were built to order. We could ship custom orders within 3 days, and our nearest competition was 2 weeks. And that's all because of the accuracy of our bills of material and everything else.
Yeah, that's a really, really good example. And you reminded me of one final point I'll throw out here, which is that new product development is really one of the hidden treasures of high-quality data. And you can see that from some of the more savvy organizations, even things like FedEx, for example, or the U.S. Post Office has some new offerings where they can price things right, and they can also ensure that they can deliver things in certain time frames. And that's the kind of thing that you're talking about. When you get your data right, you have your processes down, you understand how those data models work, what they're doing, you have much more confidence in rolling out new products, and new products is where new money comes from, right?
Absolutely, and it's not even just products, it's also services. I mean, you look at some of these things that you're talking about. You've ordered something from a manufacturer or whatever. You want to know where your delivery is? You can say, where's my delivery now? And you can track where it is. So if it's coming from somewhere else in the world, you'll be able to see not only where it is, but which cities it's been through on its journey to make it to you.
That's right. It's a giant truth engine out there, and the better work you do in cleaning up your data, the better off you're going to be.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, this is wonderful stuff, folks. We've been talking to Ron Huizenga, one of the experts out there in the field of data modeling. We're very happy to have you on the show and just out there in the real world helping solve those pain points, because this really is the matrix that kind of holds the data world together. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, folks. Take care. You've been listening to Deep Dive with Embarcadero. We'll catch up to you next time, folks. Bye-bye.